On January 12, 1888, the temperature in the Dakota Territory plummeted from a manageable 20 degrees above zero to a lethal 40 degrees below in the span of 3 hours. This was not a gradual decline. It was an atmospheric hammer blow that froze cattle where they stood and turned standard timber lungs into ice within minutes. In the valley settlement of Oakhaven, the architectural standard was the balloon-framed house, quick to build, reliant on thin lumber, and utterly dependent on the continuous roar of a cast-iron stove to keep the interior livable. These structures were symbols of civilization and speed, the preferred method of the era's expansionists. However, 3 miles up the northern ridge, tucked against a granite outcrop that cut the prevailing wind like a ship's prow, stood an anomaly. It was a low-slung, ugly thing by conventional standards, buried 3 feet into the earth and walled with 2 feet of unmortared fieldstone. The locals called it Thorn's Tomb, a derisive nickname for what they assumed was the folly of a madman who preferred caves to comfort. But as the mercury vanished into the bulb of the thermometer and the wind chill factor hit numbers that defied calculation, the interior temperature of that stone structure held steady at 55 degrees, fueled by nothing more than the retained heat of the previous week and a single small fire. The difference between life and death that night was not courage, but thermal mass. 6 months prior to the freeze, Tobias Thorne had arrived in Oakhaven with a wagon full of heavy tools and a distinct lack of interest in the town's social hierarchy. He was a man who spoke in measurements rather than pleasantries, a habit that immediately alienated him from the local establishment. While other newcomers scrambled for the flat, grassy plots near the creek, Tobias purchased a rocky, north-facing slope that the land office had considered unsellable. The soil was too thin for farming and the grade was too steep for cattle, but Tobias saw something else. A localized microclimate shielded by a natural rock wall and an abundance of raw building material. He wasn't looking for a view. He was looking for a heat sink. The town surveyor, a credentialed and confident man named Hiram Preek, took immediate offense to Tobias's rejection of the valley. Preek was a vocal advocate for modern framing techniques, preaching the gospel of 2x4 studs and clapboard siding as the future of the West. "You're buying a graveyard, son," Preek had told him, leaning against the counter of the general store. "That slope takes the brunt of the northers. You'll be blown off the mountain before Christmas." Tobias had merely tapped the counter with a calloused finger. "The wind is only a problem if you fight it, Mr. Preek. I intend to let it flow over me." The construction process began not with wood, but with a shovel. Tobias spent the first 3 weeks digging, a grueling process that confirmed the town's suspicion that he was digging his own grave. He excavated a 20 by 20 square, going down 4 feet until he hit the bedrock. This was the first principle of his design, ground coupling. By sinking the floor below the frost line, he was tapping into the Earth's constant temperature, ensuring that even without heat, the room would rarely drop below freezing. Clara Mills, the daughter of the local miller and a woman possessed of a sharp, practical intelligence, was the only one who didn't laugh. She drove her buckboard up the ridge once a week to deliver supplies, often lingering to watch the strange engineering unfold. "They say you're building a root cellar for a giant," Clara noted one afternoon, watching Tobias leverage a 300-pound slab of limestone into place. "It's a thermal battery," Tobias corrected, wiping sweat from his eyes. "Stone takes a long time to heat up, Clara, but it takes just as long to cool down. If I make these walls 24 inches thick, the heat from the noon sun will reach the interior by midnight." It was a courtship of physics. He wasn't offering her flowers. He was offering her the promise of a home that wouldn't freeze her to death. Clara found the logic far more compelling than the empty bravado of the cowboys in town. By late August, the walls had risen to shoulder height, a chaotic-looking mosaic of gray and brown stone that offended Hiram Preek's sense of order. Preek rode up specifically to critique the lack of mortar. Tobias was using a dry stack method for the outer dominance, filling the inner gaps with a mixture of clay, sand, and straw. "It's unstable," Preek declared, sitting high on his horse to maintain his elevation over the builder. "Without lime mortar on the face, the freeze-thaw cycle will heave those stones right out of the wall. It's engineering suicide." Tobias didn't look up from his work. Carefully fitting a keystone into a small window arch, mortar traps moisture, Tobias said, his voice flat and matter-of-fact. Trapped moisture freezes and cracks. These stones can move. They can breathe. Gravity holds them, not glue. When the wind hits a rigid wall, it breaks. When it hits this, the weight absorbs the shock, Preek scoffed, shaking his head. You're throwing away centuries of progress for the sake of piling rocks. When the roof goes on, the lateral thrust will push these walls out. Mark my words, he rode off, confident in his textbook knowledge. But Clara, who was stacking smaller chinking stones nearby, looked at Tobias with concern. Is he right? About the roof? Tobias looked at the massive, thick walls. He would be if I were building a roof like his. But I'm not building a sail. The roof frame went up in October, and it was the source of the greatest ridicule yet. Instead of the high-pitched A-frames that dotted the valley, designed to shed rain quickly but acting as massive wind sails, Tobias constructed a low, heavy shed roof with a shallow pitch. He used massive log beams, scorched black with fire to harden the wood and deter rot, laid close together to support an immense weight. He wasn't just planning for snow. He was planning to use the snow. Insulation, he explained to a skeptical neighbor named Gus, who had stopped by to borrow a sharpening stone. Snow is mostly air. If the roof is strong enough to hold 2 feet of it, that snow becomes a blanket. Keeps the heat in. Gus spat tobacco juice at a nearby shrub. Or it crushes you in your sleep when the timber snaps. The skepticism was valid. The load calculations required for a living roof were immense. Tobias had spent nights doing the math by candlelight, calculating the deflection of the spruce beams. He knew the margins were tight. If he misjudged the timber quality, Preek's prediction of a tomb would become literal. But as the first frosts turned the grass brittle, Tobias moved into the structure. The silence inside was absolute. The wind howled outside, tearing at the shingles of the valley homes. But inside the stone walls, the candle flame didn't even flicker. November brought the first true test of the thermal mass concept. The temperatures dipped into the teens, and while the townspeople burned through cords of wood to keep their drafty balloon-framed houses warm, Tobias burned only a few logs in his small masonry heater. The 24-inch stone walls had absorbed the solar energy of the late summer and early autumn, acting as a bank account of heat that was slowly being withdrawn. Clara visited more frequently now, often staying for dinner. The romance that had begun with curiosity had deepened into a partnership of survival. She saw the practicality of his ways, the quiet competence that didn't need to shout to be effective. One evening, sitting by the radiant heat of the stove, she asked, "Why do they hate it so much? The house?" Tobias looked at the rough stone walls, glowing warm in the firelight. "Because if this works, Clara, it means they've been doing it wrong. It means their expensive lumber and their fast construction is a liability. People don't like to be told their safety is an illusion." It was a prophetic statement. The sky to the northwest was turning a bruised purple, a color that Tobias had only seen once before, years ago in the high country. The pressure in the air was dropping so fast his ears popped. The birds had vanished from the ridge 2 days ago. The great blizzard was not just coming. It was already here, hiding behind the horizon. The storm struck at 10:35 a.m., with the violence of a physical assault, a wall of white pulverized ice moving at 50 miles per hour that erased the horizon in seconds. Tobias and Clara had been outside, securing the last of the split firewood against the southern wall, when the roar began, a sound like a freight train derailment that vibrated in their chest cavities. They had less than 60 seconds to get inside before the visibility dropped to 0. This was the terrifying reality of a whiteout on the plains. It wasn't just snow falling. It was the atmosphere itself turning opaque, stripping away all sense of direction. Tobias grabbed Clara's arm, his grip bruising through her wool coat, and pulled her toward the heavy oak door. Here, another design choice that Hiram Preek had mocked proved critical. The door opened outward. In a conventional home, an inward opening door is standard to welcome guests, but in high-wind country, an inward door relies solely on the latch to keep the weather out. An outward opening door, however, is pressed tighter into its jamb by the wind pressure. The harder the storm blew, the tighter the seal became. They fought against the gale to close it, the wind screaming as if furious at being denied entry. As the heavy latch clicked into place, the screaming stopped, replaced by a dull, distant thrumming. They were inside the lungs of the hill now. Tobias lit a lantern, the flame steady and upright. The temperature outside was plummeting toward a lethal historic low, but inside, the thermometer on the wall read 58 degrees. The thermal mass of the stone, soaked in the energy of the earth, had barely noticed the apocalypse raging on the other side of the wall. Down in the valley, the situation was developing into a catastrophe of engineering negligence. Hiram Preek's home, built to the latest balloon frame specifications, was failing the test of thermodynamics in real time. The primary enemy was not the snow, but air infiltration. The overlapping clapboards, while aesthetically pleasing, had hundreds of microscopic gaps. Under normal conditions, these were negligible. Under the pressure of a 60-mile-per-hour wind, the house acted like a sieve. The wind pressure on the north side forced freezing air through the wall cavity, stripping away the heat faster than his cast-iron stove could generate it. Preek was feeding the fire frantically, the metal sides of the stove glowing a dangerous cherry red. Yet he could see his breath in the living room. The stack effect was accelerating the disaster. As the hot air rose to the poorly insulated attic and escaped, it created a vacuum that sucked more freezing air in through the floorboards. It was a vicious cycle of heat loss. Preek, wrapped in 3 blankets and wearing his boots, watched the frost begin to crawl up the inside of his wallpaper. He realized with a sinking dread that his shelter was not an asset, but a trap. He had prioritized speed of construction and square footage over the fundamental physics of heat retention. The house was groaning, the timber frame flexing under the wind load, crying out in a language of stress fractures that Preek, for all his confidence, was terrified to interpret. He thought of the stone bunker on the hill, Thorn's tomb, and for the first time the nickname didn't seem funny. It seemed like a prayer he should have said. As night fell, the blizzard evolved from a temperature crisis into a structural one. The snow was not falling vertically. It was being driven horizontally, catching on every obstruction and forming drifts that hardened like concrete. On the ridge, the wind hit the angled slope of Tobias's earth-bermed wall and vaulted over the roof, carrying much of the snow with it. However, the accumulation that did settle on the low-pitch roof was significant. Clara watched the heavy log beams above their heads, her eyes tracing the grain of the scorched wood. "It's heavy," she whispered, the fear evident in her voice. "How much can it hold?" Tobias was checking the center post, a massive trunk of seasoned oak he had placed dead center in the room. "The snow is wet initially, but this cold is drying it out. It's about 15 pounds per square foot right now," Tobias said, his voice calm, rooted in the math he had done months ago. "The beams are rated for 40. And remember, Clara, that snow is a blanket. It's adding an R value of nearly 20 to our roof." He took her hand, his rough palm warming her cold fingers. The romance between them wasn't built on poetry, but on the shared intimacy of survival. His competence was a form of protection, and her trust was the ultimate validation. While the wind howled like a banshee, trying to peel the roof off, the aerodynamic profile of the structure forced the air stream down, pressing the building harder into the earth. The structure wasn't fighting the storm. It was using the storm's own energy to anchor itself. They ate a warm stew, the pot simmering on the masonry heater, while 3 miles away, the roof of the town's livery stable succumbed to the load, collapsing with a sound that was swallowed instantly by the wind. The morning brought a silence so profound it felt heavy. The wind had died as quickly as it had risen, leaving a landscape that looked less like the Dakota Territory and more like the surface of the moon. Drifts 20 feet high buried entire buildings. Tobias and Clara woke to a room that was still 50 degrees. The fire had burned down to coals hours ago, but the stone walls were now radiating the stored heat back into the room, a thermal flywheel that kept the lethal cold at bay. Tobias went to the door and pushed. It didn't budge. "Drifted over," he said, not with panic, but with the grim satisfaction of a man who had prepared for this variable. He moved to the small, high-ventilation hatch on the south side, the leeward side, which he had designed specifically for egress in deep snow. Climbing out, he shielded his eyes against the blinding glare of the sun on fresh ice. The world had been scrubbed clean. He reached down and pulled Clara up beside him. They stood on the roof of their home, which was now just a subtle rise in the snowpack, and looked down toward Oakhaven. The valley was a graveyard of broken timber. Chimneys stood like headstones where roofs had caved in. The smoke rising from the surviving houses was thin and desperate. "We have to go down," Clara said, her voice trembling not from cold, but from the sight of the devastation. "They'll need shovels," Tobias nodded, gripping her shoulder. "We'll bring the sled. And the extra wood." It was the turning point where the hermit of the hill became the lifeline of the valley. The rescue effort took 3 days, but the lesson would last a generation. When Tobias and Clara reached Hiram Preek's house, they found the surveyor alive but humbled, huddled in the corner of his kitchen, burning his own furniture to keep from freezing. The frost on the interior walls was half an inch thick. When Preek saw Tobias, standing in the ruined doorway with a shovel and a thermos of hot broth, the arrogance that had defined their relationship evaporated. He didn't say a word. He simply took the broth, his hands shaking violently. In the weeks that followed, as the thaw revealed the full extent of the structural failures in town, the narrative shifted. The tomb was no longer a joke. It was a blueprint. Men who had mocked the stone walls came up the ridge to measure the thickness. They asked about the depth of the floor, the orientation of the windows, and the sourcing of the thermal mass. Tobias answered every question, sharing the knowledge freely, understanding that, in this frontier, secrets killed people. The romance between him and Clara became a foundational legend of the new community. A union forged not just in affection, but in the fire of proven competence. They married in the spring, in a ceremony held outside the stone shelter. Hiram Preek attended, standing quietly in the back. When the town rebuilt, the new structures were lower, the walls were thicker, and the stoves were placed centrally. They didn't copy Tobias entirely, tradition is a stubborn thing, but they respected the physics he had proven. The wind still blew, and the snow still fell, but the people of Oakhaven stopped fighting the land and started learning from it, guided by the silent, stubborn wisdom of the stone house on the ridge.